We'll spend today looking at Greek history, Greek religion, Greek philosophy, and Greek culture. And this will act as a foundation for some of the things that we're going to look at in future weeks. I'm sure you were all fascinated by John Frame's chapter in Revolutions in Worldview. Read that, I believe, this week, correct? Some of it was a little bit heavy, right? But it was a good chapter, good explanation, a starting point for our understanding of Greek history and Greek philosophy. One of the things that I'll say kind of up front is that Western culture finds its roots in Judeo-Christian principles, which we looked at last week with the Jewish perspective and worldview, what we get from Scripture. It finds its roots from Greek philosophy, and it finds its roots from the Roman Empire, primarily related to politics. So if you take the Greek worldview and philosophy, Roman political system and leadership, and the Judeo-Christian worldview that comes from Scripture, you put all that together, that's the framework, the threefold foundation for what we would have in contemporary Western civilization. Now, there are other things that have built on top of that, but that's exactly what they've done. They've built on top of that framework to get us to where we are today. We'll look at some of the things that have shaped us from Greek history and philosophy. So we'll jump right in. Greek historical timeline. I'm not going to ask you to make note of much of this. Maybe one or two pieces of information I'll have you write down, but I do want you to be aware of it. 2900 to 2000 is the Bronze Age. 2500 is the Great Minoan civilization prior to the contemporary, what we would understand as ancient Greek civilization. 1200 BC is the Trojan War, the destruction of Troy, made famous in what book?
The Iliad.
The Iliad and the Odyssey. Good job. 1050 to 750 BC would be the Dark Ages of Greece and the fall of Mycenaean culture. And 850 to 700 BC is the development of the first Greek alphabet. 776, you might want to write that down just for like completely unimportant information, trivia information. Might help you one day in a Jeopardy question. 776, the first Olympic Games were staged, 2,700 years ago. Pretty crazy. 750 to 700 BC, Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey, 500 years after the events took place. So his story about the Iliad and the Odyssey was 500 years after the supposed events, or the events of the destruction of Troy that he wrote about. First Mycenaean War, the Spartans conquered Peloponnesia, 730 to 710. The rise of the Greek tyrants, 650. Anybody heard of draconian law? You've heard that? Have you heard that term?
Okay.
Draconian, completely barbaric law code. It's the idea that it's out of date. Well, that comes from this gentleman, Draco. He introduced the code of law in 621, and it was barbaric and brutal, and so that term got its name from Draco, one of the tyrants in ancient Greek culture. 600 BC, Greek coin currency was introduced. You do need to write down the top note there. 500 to 323 is the Greek classical period. And if you want to write out beside that, that would be the era of Greek philosophy. So the Greek classical period is the era of Greek philosophy, which we'll look at today and next week. 505 BC, Cleisthenes introduced democracy in Athens. 490 BC, you have the Greek-Persian Wars led by Xerxes. 468 BC, Sophocles wrote his first tragedy. Anybody read any of Sophocles' works? Man, they are out there. Anybody read them? Nobody. Be an exercise in sanctification if you had to do that. I had to do that in a literature class. Sophoclean tragedy. It's weird stuff. But nobody in here understands because you haven't read it. Okay. 461 to 446, the Peloponnesian Wars begin between Sparta and Athens. Sparta and Athens were the two main city-states within ancient Greek culture, and we'll look at those in a little more detail in just a minute. 449 to 432, you had the construction of the Parthenon and the Acropolis in Athens. 441, Euripides wrote his first tragedy. We'll skip Pericles. Skip the bubonic plague, skip the second Peloponnesian Wars between Sparta and Athens. Construction of the temple Athena Nike. Nike is a symbol that comes from ancient Greek culture.
Doesn't it mean victory?
I think so. Socrates was executed for his opposition to the 30 Tyrants in 399. We'll look at Socrates in a little more detail in a minute. 386, Plato founded the Academy, and the Academy was the first European institute for higher education. It wouldn't be exactly what we would call a college or university today, but it is the precursor to any of that. 384, Aristotle was born, and in 359, Philip II became king of the Greeks. Anybody know where Philip II was from?
Macedon.
Macedonia.
Yeah.
Present-day Macedonia, and then it would have been Macedon. Does anybody know why Philip II is important?
The father of Alexander, right?
That's right. Philip II was the father of Alexander, who would become Alexander the Great and lead the Greeks to become a great world empire, at least for a short period of time. And we'll look at him in a little while, too. Alexander the Great was born in 356. He defeated the Persians at Issus and was given Egypt by the Persian satrap, where he built a capital of Alexandria and founded the library. And notice how old was he when he defeated the Persians? Somebody do the math.
23.
How old?
No, he was 17. It's 20. 23, yeah.
17 or 23, which is it?
Any other guess?
23.
23. He was 23.
Because it would be
It's 23.
139.
Remember, in BC, it comes down. AD, we're going up in years. BC, it's going down in years. 23 years old. How many of you in here are younger than 23?
I can do
I
that.
think I'm well on my way there.
He was leading a world empire at 23 years old. Yeah, I mean, talk about ambitious. He was a very, very ambitious man.
He killed his dad to get to that point.
Do what?
He killed his father
Yes.
just to get to that point. He was so ambitious.
And look when he died.
33.
He's 33 years old.
He pretty much drank himself to death, right?
He did what?
Pretty much drank himself to death, right?
They don't know exactly the cause of death. He was in Persia at the time. I mean, he extended in 10 years. He extended the Greek Empire all the way to the borders of India. He didn't necessarily take over India, but he attempted to, and came back into Persia and was kind of hanging out there. And he wore himself out. He could have had a disease. He probably did have some kind of disease connected to that was made worse by alcohol. You know, alcohol acts as a dehydrates you.
Yeah.
So it's not a good form of, it doesn't help your body out. So they don't know the exact cause of death, but they can speculate. Only 33 years old when he died. How many of you are older than 33?
Oh, okay.
So, we've well outlived Alexander's influence in the world, just based on pure age. But he conquered the whole known world at the time in about 12 years. It is nuts. It is nuts. The Hellenistic period is the period in which Alexander spread Greek culture, or at least Greek culture spread because of Alexander's empire. It would probably be a safer way to say that. 323 to 31 BC. And in that spread of the Hellenistic culture, it was an adoption in the known world of Greek principles, Greek culture, Greek ideas, but more importantly, the Greek language. The reason that the New Testament was written in Greek and not Hebrew is because of Alexander's empire. He spread the Greek empire, and he spread the Greek culture, and he spread the Greek language so that, well, not so that, but he spread that for his own benefit and ambition. But what happened is the Greek language became the universal language of the day. Even with the advent of the Roman Empire, which we'll look at, maybe get into next week, but certainly finish up the week after, you see the spread of the Roman Empire. They spoke Latin in Rome. They spoke Greek everywhere else. If you were anybody who did anything, who knew anything in the ancient world, you spoke Greek. So with the New Testament being written in Greek, one very specific application we can take for that as biblical students and biblical scholars is that the Hebrew Old Testament was written to a specific group of people. It's written for the nations. I mean, God wanted to show himself off not just to the people of Israel, but to everyone. But in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament Bible, was written to a specific group of people. Okay? The Greek New Testament was not written to a specific group of people. It was written for all of the people in the world during the day. It wasn't just written to Jewish Christians, and it wasn't just written to Greek Christians, and it wasn't just written to Roman Christians. It was written in the language that everybody on the faith in the known world would have had access to. It's kind of an obvious way of God saying this message is for everyone, which is why we are required as Bible students to study and know Greek, because it was written in the Greek language. We'll come back to that thought and that idea further on as we move forward in our study of particularly Christian history, and we'll look at that in a couple weeks as well. Greek values and paradigms. These are some things that the Greeks have given to us that we may or may not be aware of, but come from Greek history and philosophy. One is polis, means Greek for city. So you have Annapolis, Metropolis in the world of Superman. Any word that ends in polis comes from the Greek word for city. Did you know that?
No.
Now you do. Watch Jeopardy. Might come up on a question. Functionally, the Greeks developed into two primarily paradigmatic city-states, Athens and Sparta. You need to write this down. This, I am confident, will be a test question. Sparta. Sparta was known as a political oligarchy, which limited the rule to a few. It would not necessarily be an aristocracy. An aristocracy is where people are essentially born into the upper level leadership in a government setting, such as similar to what would have happened in France or England at the time. Although France and England in the 15, 16, 1700s were ruled by a monarchy. They had a king and a queen. But an aristocracy would be kind of the elites, the wealthy people. An oligarchy is different from that in the sense that you weren't necessarily born into your leadership position, but when you gained it and you earned it, you had the power. It didn't matter what your station in life was when you were born. If you got to that status of being in the elite of the day, you got to rule. It was in some ways a pretty cruel way to rule. If you know anything about Sparta, they were very militaristic culture as far as the city-state was concerned. So Sparta would have been an oligarchy. A few people ruled. Athens would have been a democracy. And that happened in 505. Democracy was introduced in Athens. Now, that's different from democracy we talk about today, okay? Practically speaking, Athens' democracy was 30% participation. You had to be an adult male within a certain age range, and you had to be a free adult male. Slaves couldn't vote, children couldn't vote. If you were too old, you couldn't vote. If you were too young, you couldn't vote. And if you were a female, you couldn't vote. So we're not talking about a democratic status like we would look at today, where everybody in our nation above the age of 18 has the right and value and opportunity to vote. Practically meant 30% participation. And it wasn't a republic. Rome would have a republic. We have a republic. You knew that, right? We don't have a democracy. We have a democratic republic. Everybody can vote, but we vote not people to rule us, but we vote representatives to speak for us. It's a different form of government. Rome had that, at least to begin with. We'll look at that in the weeks to come, and then we'll certainly, in this course, next quarter, look at our particular form of government. Mike?
In Greece, how did women become wives?
I don't know. And it's not tremendously pertinent for what we're trying to do. So.
I'm just wondering. You know, they said they didn't have rights. I just wondered if they were given in marriage. Or...
Well, I mean, I'm not saying they didn't have rights. I'm just saying they couldn't vote. In Athens, of course, they couldn't vote in Sparta either. I mean, but Sparta wasn't based on voting. But in a democratic system, we just kind of assume, well, a woman can vote. Well, that didn't even happen in the United States till the early 1900s. Am I right on that? It's like the 14th, 15th, 16th Amendment. I don't remember. I should know off the top of my head which amendment it was to the Constitution that gave the women the right to vote. But I don't remember off the top of my head. But it didn't happen in the United States until the 20th century.
Like 1939 was in my head.
I don't know.
1930s.
I think it was 19 teens.
Really?
If I
Yeah,
remember
it's in
correctly.
teens.
But I just don't remember the specific. But anyway, that's Sparta and Athens, and you need to know that for your test.
1919.
1919. Thank you.
What amendment?
Which amendment was it?
19th Amendment.
19th Amendment. Oh, well, that should be
1919.
Well, it was passed by Congress on June 4th, 1919, and then ratified on August 18th, 1920.
Cool. Thank you, Nicholas. Is that Wikipedia?
No, it was Google.
It's Google. These two groups fought the Peloponnesian Wars. Peloponnesian Wars were the battle to control Greece, Sparta, and Athens. Ambition or arete, the Greek word is arete or excellence. That was a Greek value. In other words, we want to be great. That's where the Olympic Games came from. They
I read
wanted
about that.
to
That was weird.
do what?
I was reading about that. That was so weird how they
That was a little weird.
how they did the
The Olympic Games naked? You mean?
yeah, and the man versus that was a little weird.
Well, I mean, they didn't have Under Armour. And so any clothing that they would have had,
But they did
think
it.
about the clothing they would have had then would have been a hindrance,
But they did have Nike.
not an assistance.
They had something. They chose to go naked.
Yeah, they did. They did.
They were proud.
Because, again, their clothing would have inhibited their ability to do their absolute best. Not today. I mean, the clothing we wear, the athletic wear we wear, doesn't inhibit anything. In terms of our ability to run or to sweat or anything like that. But I mean, you're wearing a cotton or a wool toga or whatever it is you're wearing. Even if you do what they did in Scripture, which when it says gird up your loins, and that's a picture for the men taking the robes and pulling the robes through their legs and tucking it in their belt, like basically giving them shorts, is what it did. So they would be able to move and be able to run and be able to kind of get somewhere. Get somewhere quickly. But even in that sense, that's just for a quick, short burst of activity. If you're going to run a marathon, man, you don't want to sweat in something that's going to get weighed down. And inhibit your ability to use to be excellent. And the Greeks valued excellence. In fact, I think we've picked up on this particular value in contemporary American culture. Some of the biggest industries we have in our nation are sports. All about showing off what you can do athletically. We didn't get that from the biblical or Hebrew perspective. We got that from the Greek worldview, Greek perspective. So I think that's something we picked up. That certainly influenced, contemporary American culture. The Greeks gave us some insights for government and politics. we'll highlight those more when we get to the Roman worldview, though. You have the Greek classical works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as the Greek tragedies. If you go to a school after Fruitland and have to go to a liberal arts university to finish your degree at North Greenville or Gardner-Webb or anywhere like that, and you have to sit in a literature class, you will be introduced to Greek literature. Stuff you still read. I mean, I read Sophoclean tragedies written 25, 26, 2700 years ago. We're still reading them today because they tap into things that are characteristics, areas of life that are human. And so it's things that last. We don't read much from 2,700 years ago, but you do read some, and some of what you read comes from the Greek history and Greek worldview. You have the philosophical way to the classical age. You'll see that in a few minutes as we begin looking through the philosophers. You have the first historians. As we would talk about modern history, Herodotus and Thucydides. They gave us history as we would know history to be now, where they recorded events and they told us what happened and they told us how it happened. They are the first historians. So this class, Western Civilization, which is a history class, in some ways owes its existence to men like Herodotus and Thucydides, Greeks. You have the disbursement of the Greek Hellenistic culture. I noted that just a minute ago, and we'll look at that in more detail in weeks to come. The lingua franca, the ancient world, I mentioned that as well, which is the world language, the Greek languages that spread through ancient culture. Now, Greek religion and philosophy. Let me give you a heads up before we jump right into this. Some of this is going to be odd. Some of this is going to be weird. Remember, this is from 25, 26, 2,700 years ago. Fair enough? Just jump in with me, and we'll have a good time looking at weird stuff. Okay? If we don't understand Greek religion, we can't understand Greek philosophy, by the way. The reason we have to do an introduction from Greek religion is because Greek philosophy was a reaction to the religious expression of the day, the Greek religious expression. So we don't have a baseline for understanding that. It's really hard to just jump in and look at Thales and look at Socrates and look at Plato and look at the other philosophers and say this is what they were talking about. Because what they were talking about was based on what the Greek people were believing and holding on to religiously speaking. So we have to understand Greek religion, at least to an extent. So we're going to get a baseline in the next maybe 15 or 20 minutes. So without a foundational understanding of the Homeric vision of Greek religion, it's hard for us to understand the development of Greek philosophy, which is tremendously important for our contemporary culture and worldview. In fact, if you go to a philosophy class at any institute of higher education, you will read Plato, who referenced Socrates. You'll learn about Socrates. You'll read Plato and Aristotle. And if you want to know anything about Middle Age philosophy, even Middle Age theology, you have to understand a little bit about Aristotle, because Thomas Aquinas is someone that you and I interact with, even though we don't know we interact with Thomas Aquinas. He built his theology based in large part on the philosophy and the ideas of Aristotle, who was not a Christian. But Aristotle influenced the Middle Ages significantly. So we're going to interact with Greek philosophy. In order to understand where Greek philosophy comes from, we have to understand a little bit about Greek religion. Homer recorded, probably in part from oral history, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad, of course, describes the Trojan War, which is popularized by the movie Troy, if you've seen that. The Odyssey recounts the journey of Odysseus after the Trojan War back home. Incidentally, we don't know much of Homer except from these two novels that he gave us. Both stories detail the functional role of the Greek gods in the affairs of men. And that would be a simple way to understand Greek religion. The Greek gods in Homer's works are petulant, snarky, emotional, and not so different from humans, except for the fact that they have more power than humans. Okay? If you've seen the movie Troy, the one with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana, that is not an accurate depiction of Homer's Iliad.
That's awesome.
because what they did in that movie is they tried to historicize it. In other words, they depicted the events written in the Iliad from a historical, actual event perspective. Could it have happened that way? Sure. But in Homer's Iliad, he writes about how the gods interacted in the battles, and how the gods interacted with the people, and how the gods would go down and influence Achilles, or influence Agamemnon, or influence the other characters in the story to do certain things because the gods had an interest in the characters doing certain things. And that was Homer's vision, or Homer's idea, of the way the Greek gods interacted in the world of men. And so the Greek religious perspective, in large part, was based on that idea. If it was oral history, it means that Homer was invested in this concept of the gods interacting with humanity in these kind of ways, and so he just wrote about it. He picked a story from history, connected the gods to it, and gave us a perspective, or gave his age a perspective of how the gods interacted with humanity. Fascinating. Wrong, but fascinating. This would be the age of Zeus, the age of Apollos, and the age of the other gods in the Greek pantheon that you've seen in movies, say, The Clash of the Titans or Wrath of the Titans. Anybody seen either of those? Fascinating movies. Not for what we learn and what we should be benefited by, but if you want to get a visual picture of the way the Greek gods were understood in the 500s, 600s, 700s BC, that's a pretty decent picture of how the Greeks viewed their godhead and their god system. So there's Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. There's a map of the Greece during the time of the Iliad. A question we might ask is, did the events described in Homer's stories actually happen? Was there actually a Trojan horse that people were sent inside as a gift? Is that actually how Troy was destroyed? We might ask that. Why would we ask that? Because we're concerned about history. We're concerned about the historical truth or veracity of those events. Interestingly, Homer's Greeks would not have asked that question. They were not concerned with propositional truths. Did something happen, actually? They were concerned with the stories. And in their mind, the stories told or described for them how the gods interacted with people. And that's the point of Homer's stories for his day. What we take from it is exactly what you see in the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. What you see is our thought process on what happened historically. In other words, there are a lot of people today that would watch the movie Troy and then say, yeah, in 1200 BC, this is what happened. Interestingly, that wasn't the reason Homer wrote the stories, and it certainly could have been what happened. But that's not the point of Homer's stories. The point of Homer's stories is not to tell us historical events that actually happened. It's to describe for the people in his own day, 700 BC, how the Greek gods influenced and interacted with and in the world of men. So, are you tracking with me so far?
It's not a historical book, it's more of a religious writing?
Exactly.
Okay.
But we look at it, we shift it. We kind of throw in contemporary literary culture, contemporary literary exploration of the Iliad and the Odyssey. What we try to do is pull out what's history and what's religion and say, okay, this is what happened historically, which is why in that movie you don't see any interaction from the gods. If there's any mention of the gods, it's passing mention. There are no gods in the movie. But in Homer's Iliad, the gods are all over the place. The gods influenced nearly every decision throughout the entire story. Because that's the way the Greeks thought about their gods. And Homer was giving a picture, a theological picture, if you will. Not theology that we would be comfortable with, but the theology of his day. He was giving that picture for the people of his own day to understand how the Greek gods interacted with the world, with and in the world of men. So history wasn't the important part in terms of in its own day, in its own context. Theology was what Homer was trying to do. The fact of the matter is that Greek religion, pre-Christianity, So this would be BC, and this is the time we're looking at, before the advent of evangelism and the truth of the gospel, and Jesus had come. Greek religion was a wealthy and powerful influence in the ancient world. And this is the reason for the popularity of Homer's works. Because as he spread ideas about Greek religion, it helped the concept that gave wealth and control to the Greek religious systems of the day. And I'm going to explain to you where that comes from. Delphi, and we'll look at this as an illustration, Delphi was, in a sense, the center of Greek religion. So we'll do one more slide and then we'll take a break. What is Delphi? The oracle at Delphi and Apollo's temple. The oracle was believed to have the ability to tell the future and was supposed to have successfully predicted the Trojan Wars, among other things. She was also consulted for personal, political, and religious means. So she had influence, she had power. People of means and people of wealth came to see the oracle of Delphi and get a prophecy or a prediction or an idea. Cleisthenes, who introduced democracy in Athens around 500 BC, and we noted him in our historical timeline, he was supposed to have actually consulted the oracle and gave her many gifts in return for political advancement. And in a real sense, he gave the oracle credit for introducing democracy in Athens. So it has, this religious system has some historical connections, to real events in history. In other words, the religious system had influence in its own day.
I have a question. Was there more than one oracle?
There were in the ancient world. This particular oracle resided at the top of Mount Parnassus, and we'll look at that as we continue going on, and was known as the oracle at Delphi. This oracle, this particular temple, was dedicated to the god Apollo, who in Greek mythology was the son of Zeus and associated with prophecy, music, and healing. Let's go ahead and get through one more slide, and then we'll take a break, just so you can get the crazy part and have 10 minutes or so to digest that. Delphi was located at the foot of Mount Parnassus, located about 100 miles from Athens. So you had to travel a little ways to get to the oracle of Delphi, to even meet with them. And there's a picture of it, Apollo's temple there on the right. And you can sort of see, it's a terrible picture, but you can sort of see the journey there on the left to try to get up to where the oracle would have resided. The role of the oracle was filled by women, usually called Pythia, reference to the legend of Apollo killing a dragon named Pytho, where we get our word python, large snake, from. The first oracle was around the 7th century BCE, and this is a quote, which is why it's BCE. It's from a text that instead of used BC, they used BCE, which is before Common Era. Anyway, the first one was named Sybil, and thereafter every oracle was named Sybil. She sat on the Sibylline rock to breathe the vapors that allowed her to make predictions, which were normally incoherent babbling, which had to be interpreted by a priest. So this woman would sit on a rock, breathe what is believed to be some kind of methane combination vapors. Okay? Yeah, paint fumes. Yeah. Something weird and odd like that. And then she was supposed to have babbled something, and the priest interpreted it for whoever was inquiring from the oracle.
Is that third verse there, really?
Yes. The Delphic religion was unrivaled in power and influence for approximately 1,000 years. Much wealth and many gifts were given to the treasury at Delphi in exchange for her wisdom.